In 1986, Tom Young arrived in the quiet former mining town of Silver Plume, Colorado, with a simple dream. As a veteran and an outdoorsman, he found himself wanting a more peaceful and quiet life in the mountains. So, he took his savings and leased a small storefront along the town's narrow main street. While Tom knew that his bookstore was never going to make him incredibly wealthy, that's not really what it was about for him. From reading about Tom, I get the sense that he just wanted to be his own boss and live life the way he wanted, while getting by relatively comfortably. We do know that he loved running his store, though the business never thrived, which he already knew was going to be the case. But it's not as if it failed either, it was just plodding along. Something would happen to Tom on the 7th of September 1987, when he walked out of his bookstore for the final time with his dog, Gus. He'd planned a hike up into the surrounding mountains, and after walking away from the store and leaving the town, he disappeared and just never came back. For just shy of a month, Tom was not reported missing. As a general rule, people don't really go missing from this place very regularly. In fact, it is such a rare occurrence that there is really no data that I could find in regards to missing people in this place, outside of just 2 people. One of them was Tom. He was well liked in the town. Despite being somewhat reclusive, he was welcomed into the close-knit community that it was. After being there for around 1 year, people around Silver Plume knew that he expressed wanting to leave the town for a while and go travelling elsewhere. While he was missing, there were also rumours circulating that he had told some people that he'd planned a trip to Europe. Because he was fairly reclusive, some people had just assumed that he had it in him to just up and leave and start fresh somewhere else, without telling anyone. Others guessed that he'd travelled to Europe. Additionally, nobody even knew that he'd gone for a hike that day, as he just hadn't told anyone, so people largely just felt that he'd left. While the friends he had there did find it odd that he hadn't said his goodbyes before leaving the town, in whatever manner that took, that's essentially what some thought he'd done. When he hadn't been seen for nearly a month though, it was only then that people started asking some important questions, such as, hey, does anyone know where Tom went? It was only at this stage that his disappearance was reported to the authorities, because his friends just didn't believe that he would have left his bookstore unattended for that length of time. As the months went on and nobody had heard from Tom, the rent obviously went unpaid, so the storefront was essentially reclaimed by the owner and put back up on the market for lease. Around a year after this incident, it was still the case that nobody had heard from Tom, and in June of 1988, Keith Reinhard, 49, moved to Silver Plume, and he rented the very same storefront that Tom had abandoned. It seems that Keith actually held similar motivations to Tom in the first place. He came from Chicago, which was obviously a bustling place, and far more busy than this tiny mountain town. Keith was a sports writer there, and for one reason or another, he was just desperate for a change and wanted some peace and quiet in his life. So, he moved to Silver Plume and opened up his own antique store right in the exact same place the bookstore used to be. Before we go any further, if I could just ask you to like the video and hype it, or whatever this new thing is, I'd be very grateful. Anyway, when he came to town, it was supposed to be a 3-month break from his place of work. He rented the storefront and lived in the small apartment space above it, alone. His wife Carolyn and his 3 children stayed back home in Chicago. Whatever was going on with Keith at the time, Carolyn had agreed to let him spend these months in Silver Plume, and the plan was for her to come visit later and stay for a while once he'd settled and had the antique store running. I believe that the plan was that because of whatever stresses Keith might have had, this was always supposed to be a 3-month excursion to allow him some peace of mind, and then he would return to Chicago. I at least think that's the agreement he had with Carolyn. But according to Charlie Project, it does seem as though Keith really wanted to make a success of his store and perhaps make the move more permanent with Carolyn. Either way, the family had a number of antiques already, and Keith thought that selling them this way was a good idea of earning some money on his trip, while potentially even starting this business for himself that he could run with Carolyn. And who knows, maybe one day even hand it over to his family. Keith had long conversations with his friend, Ted Parker, who owned multiple storefronts in Silver Plume, and who also just happened to own the now empty shop where Tom Young hosted the bookstore. During those talks, Keith shared that he was feeling a bit stressed and that life was getting away from him. Ted felt for him and basically just told him that he had this empty storefront with an apartment on top of it if he wanted to get away for a while. So Keith decided that he was going to rent it. This really appealed to him, as from the looks of it, he just wanted to not be in Chicago for a while. Carolyn wasn't exactly thrilled about him leaving for such a long time, but I think she recognised how much strain he was under and gave him the green light. From what I've read, it doesn't appear that there was any known turmoil between the two. I think this was just about life in general as opposed to relationship problems. The newspaper that Keith worked for accepted his request of 3 months leave and off he went. Just like Tom, Keith became well liked and accepted into the community. And of course, it was at this point that he learned about the previous bookstore and what had happened to Tom. Well, not that anybody had a clue what happened to him, but Keith became aware that both he and his dog had literally just vanished without much of an explanation. It's important to note actually that this was not Keith's first time in Silver Plume. I believe that he'd visited Ted a handful of times over the years, but it was only now that he was properly integrating himself into the town, since he'd be staying there for an extended period. Keith began to speak to the locals, and he essentially started his own investigation in some sense into Tom's disappearance. For one reason or another, it just gripped him, and it seems that he wanted to be the one to figure out what exactly had happened. In fact, he became so infatuated with the whole thing that he began to write a book about Tom and what transpired. Keith began to hike the area surrounding the town, sometimes on his own, and it seems that he really wanted to get into Tom's headspace and try to retrace his steps. This was largely not possible though, because the locals had already told him about the extensive search efforts that some of them were a part of, and how really they'd established nothing at all. Keith was aware that professional search teams from all over the place were brought in, alongside helicopters and search dog teams, but there were just no hits at any point. It's a real shame that the search didn't begin for around 3 to 4 weeks after Tom left in the first place, because the dogs might have found a scent somewhere had the search efforts started much sooner. The fact that the search completely failed to find anything was enough to fuel the idea that Tom had perhaps ended up somewhere else, or perhaps was out of the country entirely and in Europe. The issue was that it was largely not solvable because, as said, the area itself was vast, and while Tom liked to go on his hikes, he really could have been anywhere on the mountains. In addition to that, even if he had have gone to Europe, it's a very large place, and he could have been in any number of countries. Keith did actually pay a visit to the sheriff's office in hopes of learning more, but outside of understanding the layout of the search effort, there was really nothing more that they could tell him. Although thinking about it, if Tom had literally travelled overseas, then surely there would have been a record of him using his passport somewhere along the way. Not that any of these thoughts really matter in the end though, because on the 31st of July in 1988, around a month or so after Keith had opened his antique shop, 2 hunters who were hiking through the mountains searching for elk came across remains. The scene, essentially, was of a man sitting leaned against a tree with a dog beside him. Once authorities had made their way to the scene, they estimated that they had likely been there for around 1 year, and that based on the evidence present that I can't get too into here, the disappearance appeared to have been planned. At least, that was the drawn conclusion by the authorities. The sheriff wondered whether Tom had told people about his plans in Europe to essentially throw people off and cover for what he was planning to do. It's important to stress that the authorities looked for a reason as to why this might have happened, but they didn't come across anything obvious. It didn't appear that Tom had financial problems or anything like that. Obviously, people knew that Tom had expressed an interest in leaving the town for a while, but there wasn't any obvious inclinations that he was otherwise unhappy. The official explanation didn't really sit very well in the town though, and some were absolutely convinced that Tom and Gus had met with foul play. In their minds, I'd assume that they must have felt that Tom stumbled into whoever this person may have been, and then this third party made it appear as though Tom was responsible for what happened. One of the reasons for this is because the people who knew Tom well said that he absolutely adored Gus, and they felt strongly that he would have been more likely to rehome him first if he was absolutely set on vanishing in this way. That was all largely speculation though, and it wasn't just possible to argue against the official position taken by the sheriff's office, because there was no evidence to point to anything else. In any case, as we have established, Keith and Tom held a lot of similarities and coincidences between them already. They both ended up in Silver Plume under the same circumstances basically. They each wanted a quieter life. They both ended up renting the exact same storefront and being similarly liked and respected within the town. They each lived a very similar life there, all things considered. But there would be another, perhaps stranger coincidence that the two of them shared, so let's get bizarre. About 1 week after Tom's remains had been found, Keith would come to vanish himself. Not only was Keith's disappearance bizarre, it led to one of the most intensive search efforts to ever occur in the state of Colorado. From what I can gather, the people of Silver Plume at the time thought that with the discovery of Tom, it would essentially bring Keith's interest to an end, since it looked to be understood what had happened, even if some disagreed with the official conclusions that were drawn. That's not exactly what happened though, and on the 6th of August, the very night before he vanished, Keith attended a party. There are lots of rumours about this party, and about things he may or may not have said. Some have claimed that while there, he'd been drinking and told people about wanting to visit another state, and that it had something to do with Tom and his book. Others said that they didn't remember that, and that he hadn't touched a drop, so I don't think there's anything that can be gleaned from that. One thing that does remain fairly consistent across accounts though, is that while at this party, Keith spent a lot of time speaking to a woman who was thought to be named either Greta or Gretchen. However, nobody knew who she was, and she was not local, and was thought to be in Silver Plume from Denver. It was thought that they'd been discussing the circumstances surrounding Tom and what happened to him, though it's not known precisely what they'd been talking about in relation to the disappearance. Again, matching Tom, Keith walked out of his antique shop the day afterwards on the 7th. He locked up, and he told people that he planned to go hike up the Pendleton Mountain. Keith wasn't the fittest person in the world, but he enjoyed hiking, and he was working on his health. He was making a rather large mistake though, and this came up in the last video on Austin King, which I'll leave a link to at the top right now and in the description below. Similar to Austin, Keith had decided to go on this hike up the mountain far too late, which meant that at some point he would be travelling up and down the mountain in absolute darkness. At 4 PM, Keith went into Ted Parker's cafe, and while in there, he basically told Ted and the other regulars that he was about to make his way to the summit. His friends in the cafe thought that he was just joking, because that they knew it would take around 6 hours to reach the top. So even in the best case scenario, should Keith have started right there and then, he would have reached the top at around 10 PM. As a result of this, people thought that he wasn't serious, and they just brushed it off as a joke. This actually wasn't a joke, and it seems that Keith was serious. It's not really clear what his plan was. To actually reach the summit was unrealistic, as not only was he afraid of heights, it was just too late to be trying to do that. Instead, it was assumed by some that he was trying to do a partial ascent before turning around and returning home. But either way, this would not be advisable, because at some point while on a cold mountain, he was still going to lose the light while making his way back down towards the town. The following morning, Ted was the first person to realise that something was wrong. Ted would come and see Keith in the mornings in his antique store, but upon reaching it, it was still locked. Ted had a spare key, so he went inside and knocked on the doors upstairs to the living area, but it became apparent that nobody was home. I suppose it was at this point that Ted would have put 2 and 2 together and realised that Keith must have been serious about going up the mountain. Ted reached out to others and they checked the town, but nobody had seen him. So now, those concerned made their way to the sheriff's office and they filled out a missing persons report. Thankfully, local law enforcement took this seriously, and they began an incredibly intensive search effort. Helicopters were in the air that very day, and search dog teams were being brought in from all over the place, alongside mountain rescuers. Many from Silver Plume itself volunteered to help bring Keith home. Altogether, there was about 150 people that were stationed in the town, which was used as headquarters for the search. The days passed with no sign of Keith, and as the search grew more desperate, some in Silver Plume began to wonder if he'd even made it to the mountain at all. The surrounding forest was dense and unforgiving, and if Keith had become disoriented before reaching the trailhead, he could have ended up going the wrong way and could now be almost anywhere. He'd set off in the first place only wearing jeans and a shirt. He didn't take a backpack, any supplies or equipment. One of the search leaders commented that typically the search would locate a bunch of clues that would essentially paint a picture as to what happened. Perhaps they'd locate some abandoned gear, or they'd find food wrappers or tracks or something like that, but they never found any tracks to suggest that Keith had been anywhere specific. But because he hadn't taken anything with him, the searchers never came across anything that would give some kind of clue as to where he went. Meanwhile, investigators combed through Keith's belongings back in town. They read through his writings for the novel, they checked his camera, among other such things. They were looking for any indications at all as to what had happened, and also just wanted to know if he had just up and left purposefully. The only problem was that Keith had a wife and 3 children, all of whom he was known to have adored. He was also so determined to finish his novel that people didn't believe that he would just up and leave in such a manner. So, for those involved, the most likely explanation was the simplest one. That something went wrong that night when Keith walked into the forest to get to the mountain. Especially as things would have been dark for him, it would have been frighteningly easy for one man that was perhaps not too experienced in the great outdoors to just vanish without leaving a trace. For Keith's family, the years that followed brought more questions than it did answers. His daughter, Tiffany, offered one of the more unusual perspectives. When she was talking to a reporter, she said, "Writers like to live the story they're writing about to get a feel of it, so it's easier for them to write about it. Perhaps my father, it's always possible, wanted to feel what it's like to disappear so he could write about it." That was a theory that resonated with some at the time, as in, he didn't quite literally mean to disappear forever, but rather to get out and really immerse himself out in the wilderness. If Keith did stage his disappearance as some part of creative experiment, you might have expected him to have been found by now, unless something particularly terrible such as foul play happened while out in the forest. Other members of Keith's family were far less open to the idea that he'd left by choice. His son seemed to think that he'd met with foul play while out in the darkness. According to him, it was just unthinkable that his father, who was so dedicated to his family, could up and abandon them all. For the people of Silver Plume, Keith's story became something larger than a missing persons case. It became this largely strange and bizarre story of how a writer who becomes so fascinated with the disappearance of another came to vanish under circumstances that seem so weirdly coincidental. Some really did feel that there were too many coincidences to dismiss, and it was essentially deja vu. Both of them had rented the same storefront, and both of them had walked out of it, locked up, and then headed into the mountains, never to return. Even with Tom, his end remained unsettled in the minds of many. While the official position was that he'd planned for it to happen the way it did, many in Silver Plume believed that it was foul play, and it was just meant to look the way it did. What happened to Keith can only have fueled those suspicions further, especially since he quite literally disappeared without a trace and he was never found. People also pointed to the woman that was not local and that they'd never seen before, either Greta or Gretchen. People believed that they had discussed Tom, though they were not sure of the specifics. For one reason or another, probably because suspicions were running quite high, some people saw her as a piece of the puzzle, somehow. Ideas surrounding foul play were expanded upon, and there were those that felt the two disappearances were almost ritualistic. There's no direct evidence of that, of course, but you can see where those thoughts may have come from. You have two men who rented and lived in the same storefront building. They came to the town with similar motives, lived similar lives in the town, and then for Keith to become so fascinated about Tom's disappearance to the point that he was motivated to write a novel about him, only to then disappear himself in the exact same way, under almost pretty much the exact same circumstances, in the same area basically. I haven't seen much in the way of an extrapolation about this idea, but again, I suppose suspicions were running very high, and it was probably the case that some may have been a little paranoid. Instead of it being some kind of ritual, others wondered if both Tom, and then later Keith, had stumbled upon something that they weren't meant to see. This might have been people selling banned substances or something like that. Again though, there was no evidence of that, although I'm not really sure what evidence you could even hope to find in such a situation. There were rumours that the town might have had a substance problem back then, but I couldn't find anything definitive about it. I suppose that's just one of the problems when you have a place that's this small and remote. There's just not a lot of information on it. And I suppose some secrets would be better kept in such an environment. Keith's son seemed to think that something just wasn't right. He said, "I think there was foul play. I don't think he would have gotten up and left. I think my dad stumbled across something and he just knew too much and that's why he disappeared." Despite authorities ruling out foul play in Tom's case, many in Silver Plume never accepted that conclusion. The one detail that gnawed at those that knew Tom well was Gus. Everyone who knew Tom said the same thing about him, and that was that he adored that dog. To them, he wouldn't have included Gus in such a plan, and would have found him a new home. It was that single fact, basically, that fueled endless speculation that foul play had been involved. That Tom really did go for a hike and then encountered another person out there, and then the scene was essentially staged to make it look planned. So to them, when Keith disappeared under such similar circumstances just over a year later, I suppose you could say that it felt less like a coincidence and more of a pattern to some. People truly felt that the two stories were somehow connected, especially since Keith became so fascinated with what happened. To the locals, they kind of saw it as Keith following in Tom's footsteps so closely that he ran into the same fate, whatever that might have been. Perhaps Keith, through his own investigations, really did come to know more than others about something suspicious, pursued it, and then that led to his downfall. It is difficult to imagine that being the case though, because you might have expected local law enforcement to find evidence in the form of writing in his novel, or notes about supposed suspicions. The disappearance itself can only really have been down to one of three things. As said, it could have been foul play, though it's not clear how likely that is. It could have been that Keith purposefully wanted to disappear or to start a new life, though people didn't seem to believe that was the case. To most, it seems that Occam's razor would suggest, and the official explanation was that it was simply an accident and that Keith had gotten lost. Despite the major search, which saw over 100 people on foot in the forest, alongside professional search dog teams, there wasn't a single shred of evidence uncovered to point towards anything. It's rather unlikely that someone would have been waiting in a very remote area like this for an unsuspecting person to come along, especially at that time. It was late and a would-be assailant wouldn't expect some random person to be heading towards the mountain at such a time. Although some wondered about this Greta or Gretchen character and wondered if she'd asked to meet him out there. Although that was pure speculation, since nobody even really knew what had been discussed between the two. Some have also wondered if this woman helped Keith escape the town and helped him to start a new life, perhaps even with her. I've seen it pointed out that Keith was stressed, perhaps going through some midlife crisis even. Perhaps the thought of being back in Chicago in the near future exacerbated his feelings and made him want to leave. That would be a horrible conclusion to the story, and for most though, that didn't seem too likely because they knew that he loved his family. And as far as people were concerned, his family was everything to him. And they didn't think that he would just up and leave forever. Though to many, I'd imagine that leaving his wife and children on this 3-month sabbatical in the first place might have been a little suspicious when he came to vanish for good. I know that I've certainly had those thoughts. It is possible that he just had more turmoil going on than people realised. These are some pretty huge and sweeping changes that he was making to his life before he disappeared, after all. I believe that Carolyn was actually scheduled to come visit him the week after he vanished, and he was said to be excited and looking forward to this reunion. So it's all just very awkward and strange timings there, and it's difficult to know what to make of that. Allegedly, according to a family friend, investigators did later manage to locate Greta, but she didn't know anything about the disappearance. So if that's true, I suppose that pretty much rules out the hypothesis of her involvement in any way. So, I suppose that brings us to the final explanation, that he simply went out later than he should, he lost the light, and then he vanished into the wilderness without a trace. The mountains around Silver Plume are not exactly forgiving, especially for someone that wasn't particularly fit and didn't have much experience hiking such areas. The lands were very harsh with dense forest areas that limited visibility. There were steep cliffs and hidden drops. This also seemed to be the opinion of Ted, and he pretty much just said that he felt that Keith had simply fallen and was still up there somewhere basically. It's not too difficult to imagine how those factors, alongside limited visibility, could have ended badly that way. He also had no supplies at all and was in an area that had dangerous wildlife. In the book he was writing, he had apparently stated that Guy Gypsum, the character that represented Tom, changed into some jeans and a flannel shirt, shut up shop and headed out into the mountain. Which is quite literally what he himself actually did. So perhaps he really was trying to get into Tom's headspace by doing that. There is actually further evidence of Keith's presence on the mountain that just came to light in 2021. I will just say allegedly, actually, but in September of that year, Keith's wallet may have been discovered by 2 hikers on Pendleton Mountain. This piece of evidence has not been added to the Colorado State official website documenting this case, but if it's true, then I'd imagine it will feature in the upcoming film Dark Side of the Mountain by Eric Walters. The film is apparently in post-production, so hopefully they see it all the way through. I'm actually excited for this one. It'll be interesting to see which parts that I reported on get some more clarity, or hopefully we get some further context in general when it comes out. It's just a shame that in the end, Keith became part of the very story that he was trying to understand and write about Tom. His fascination with what happened and his determination to fully understand exactly what went down seems to have led to him heading out completely unprepared and vanishing in roughly the same area as the man that came before him. Despite such a long time passing since 1988, Keith has never been found, I suppose that now brings us to the end of this. I'll keep an eye out for the release of this film, and I'll make a post about it when and if it drops on the community page. At this point, I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a really big thank you to the patrons. I'm hoping to upload videos a little more regularly again, and the next one should hopefully be out next week, if I'm able to finish it in time. Please do remember to hype the video if you can, drop me a like or a thumbs down if you didn't, totally fine either way. Have a great week and be safe all. Peace.